This one is about Russell Brand. Now, I really do like his podcast, and I don't know. I think it's been a while since I covered Russell Brand on the show, but I do follow his podcast, Under the Skin. I think he has some interesting points. Tonight's story, he's talking about mainstream media. There is something that he pointed out in the story that I was not aware of about who they focus on and how they focus on those individuals. So I want to go ahead and share that because he is going to explain to you how the media propagandize people, how the media uses propaganda on the American people. Listen to this. Let's go in.
Now, have you become a bit sick and tired of the old mainstream media? They're constant lying, berating, telling you you're thick, dumb, racist, toxic, whatever it is this week. Well, there's a reason they talk about you that way, and that's because they're not talking to you. The mainstream media only cares about 6% of the total audience. I spoke to Ungar-Sargon on my podcast, Under the Skin, available from Luminary, about how the mainstream media has become so corrupted, has become so irrelevant, has become so out of touch. It was an absolutely fantastic conversation. Stay to the end and hit me up in the comments because there's some fantastic revelations in this video that you need to know.
Gotcha.
Okay, I want to chime in here for just a second. I want you to notice what he just said. The mainstream media only serves 6% of the audience. Their message is only aimed at 6% of you. That was pretty shocking to me because they definitely reach millions and millions of people, but they are designed in a way, and I don't think it was always this way, but today they're designed in a way to cater to 6% of the population. Most of us are not in that 6%. So I want you to remember that every time you watch mainstream media and pass that on to your friends as well. They are designed to cater to 6% of the population. Now let's go in. This is the interview he had here.
I think you talk a lot about how all news media outlets are trying to appeal to the same limited demographic. Could you tell us a bit about that, please?
Yeah, definitely. The golden age of American journalism, let's say like, the 18th century, 19th century, and early 20th century, you had the media was totally partisan. So this is a thing that I think people like to complain that our media is partisan. Actually, that it's becoming more like the UK, where every publication has a kind of political bent and everybody knows what that is, and you get the paper that appeals to you. But in the golden age of American media, the media was very, very partisan. It was just partisan on behalf of the masses. So you would have a situation like 1920s New York, where there were so many communist newspapers that you could be a communist and have 5 communist newspapers that you would never dream of opening because they were the wrong kind of communists, right? Like that was the situation. There were so many working class Americans and they had such a plethora of choices. And being a journalist, it used to be like this very working class trade, like the kind of person who became a journalist was like, actually probably someone like you, the guy sitting in the back of the classroom who can't stop cracking wise, who has like a real way with words and hates authority, and like the teacher's constantly kicking him out, and like, but he's so great, he makes everybody laugh, and he feels like it's like, yeah, that's why I was put in this classroom, is to give this teacher a hard time because fuck him, who gave him power over me, right? And he was so anti-authoritarian, maybe he had terrible parents, that he couldn't go work in the factory.
One thing I want to add in here to add on to what she's saying here, journalism used to be a gritty job. It wasn't a glamorous job. Now, some of you, if you're new, you may not know this, but I majored in broadcast journalism and English. And I remember going out in the field, it's not glamorous. Those cameras are extremely heavy. You have to go out regardless of what the weather is like. It doesn't matter if it's a hurricane. It doesn't matter if it's hot, if it's cold. You have to be prepared for all of that. But it was not glamorous. Sometimes you were hot, sometimes you were sweaty, and you had to make yourself somehow look good and presentable on camera and get that story. That's what mattered. You were chasing that story. That's not how it is today. And Matt Taibbi, I did a segment about this before where Matt Taibbi also was interviewed by Russell Brand. And that was the subject matter where he discussed that journalism has now become this elite field, that for people who have gone to schools like your everyday Joe Smo state universities, in order for them to get hired by some of these companies like the Washington Post or the New York Times, they're looking for people coming from the Ivy League schools. So the journalists that you have today, a lot of them come from wealth. They come from money. And I can give you a couple examples that you're probably familiar with. Andrew, why can't I remember his last name? CNN, white hair, Anderson Cooper. Sorry, that's bad. I almost forgot about him. Anderson Cooper is a Vanderbilt. He came from wealth. Chris Cuomo came from wealth and came from a political family. If you follow a lot of those journalists, you'll see that the one thing that they tend to have in common, they either came from Ivy League schools, they came from wealthy families, they came from elite backgrounds. That's not the way that journalism used to be. Now, if you want to get those jobs at companies like the Washington Post, CNN, the New York Times, and you went to, let's say you went to my undergrad alma mater, say you went to the University of South Carolina, good luck. You may get a job in the mailroom. I'm just being honest. So let's go back in. So, really quick, actually. So if the journalists are elite and they're from wealthy backgrounds, what demographic do you think they're going to really appeal to when they're reporting their stories? Let's go in.
Because he couldn't listen to directions and he would have been dangerous to everybody around him. So instead of going to the factory like everybody else in his class, he would become a journalist, right? And when he went to be a journalist, he would be introduced to politicians and he would be exactly the same way he was in that classroom. He would think it was his job to defy that authority and demand justice on behalf of the little guy that he lived with, that he still lived in those communities. That was like most of American journalism. But that same thing that happened those last 50 years where Democrats started, they abandoned the working class. They started to rise economically with that tide of that economy they built. That's really good for people in knowledge industry jobs. Journalists started to become more and more highly educated. They started to make more and more money. And now they're really in the top 10. But you really have to come from money to even become a journalist here. Actually, in the UK, it's even worse. It's like the top 2% or something. But you have to go to these really fancy schools. You have to take all these unpaid internships. So if you're working your way through college, you can forget about it.
That's the problem that a lot of us run into. And that's actually a problem that I ran into when I was in undergrad. Yeah, I was offered internships, but all of them were unpaid. And if you're coming from, I was coming from a middle-class family. If you're coming from a middle-class family and I had student loans, so obviously my parents didn't have enough money to pay for all of my schooling. That's why I had student loans. I couldn't really afford to do an unpaid internship, because that meant that was a whole summer that I wasn't working at my part-time job where I could actually make money over the summer and save up money for my books that I would need to get when I came back in the fall. So this is how the working class is weeded out, even in something like journalism. Because the reality is, let's say you get that unpaid internship, but it's in a different city or it's in a different state. Now you have to have money to move to that state. And you have to have money to get an apartment for that summer to live there to do the internship. You're still going to need money for food. You're still going to need money for transportation. But remember, you're working, but you're not getting paid. This is how a lot of the working class, like college students coming from those families and the middle class families, this is how they don't end up getting those same career opportunities as their wealthier classmates, because I could not afford to take an unpaid internship. And if you were like me, you probably couldn't afford to do it either. You have to pay rent, right? So I went to school in the South. A lot of those internships for journalism, guess where they were? LA, New York, Boston, Seattle. Not there with me. Not there with me. So what that meant is I would have to move. So then you needed money for that. That's why I really don't like the whole unpaid internship thing. Like, it's kind of, I don't like it. yeah, you can get class credit for it, but the reality is the majority of the college students, at least at my school, couldn't afford an unpaid internship. If you were on financial aid in some way, shape, or form, 9 times out of 10, you could not afford that. So again, they are taking a certain profession and they are taking that profession and making it more available to the wealthier class. This comes back to the class issue. This is why I try to connect. I try to make this connection every night on my show, how a lot of these issues that we discuss are all connected to class, because you are now taking a certain segment of the population and you're kind of weeding them out. You're preventing them from having those opportunities. And I don't feel that that's fair. But let's go back in.
The New York Times, NPR, Washington Post, Wall Street Journal, these people take their interns from the top 1% of universities. And there's no more local news. It sort of disappeared, right? So the class of journalists became like, there was just a status revolution. They went from being the little guy demanding justice from the powerful to part of the powerful. They go to school with the people who end up being politicians that they cover. They live in the same neighborhoods and all this stuff. And at the same time, the digital media, the way that digital media works is the way you measure success. I mean, you know this from your show, but is in terms of engagement, right? How many people were engaged? And, you know, it's something probably you also have noticed is like the most engaged people are always the most extreme. So if you're the New York Times, you suddenly have this like overeducated elite class of journalists, but you want to be catering to the kids they went to school with who are now living in the same expensive cities because their data is the data that, you know, matters, that they can sell, that they can make a profit off of. Oh,
and you're sending that group of elite journalists to go report on stories in poor and working class neighborhoods that they have no affiliation with, they have no connection to. So this is who is speaking for the working class people. I think that's important for people to really hear. The stories that you are reading in the New York Times, in the Washington Post, 9 times out of 10, those journalists, they are reporting on stories of a certain class that they have no experience with. They literally come into those neighborhoods, they take notes, they interview a couple of people, and they go write a story. That's just something to think about.
Luckily for them, they know exactly how to appeal to them and how to appeal to their emotions because their newsroom is made up of that exact same class. And so when you used to have the situation where, like, you know, a newspaper, let's say you'd have a town that was like 50% Democrats, 50% Republicans, right? And then you had, a one newspaper in this town, right? So this newspaper, right, let's say in the 70s, right, before the big sorting, the guy who owned that paper, he could make a choice. I could let my journalists report the news in a lefty version, right? And get all of the Democrats, but then I lose 50% of the townsfolk. If I report the news straight and have a balanced editorial page, I can get the whole town to read my paper. Today in digital media, it's the exact opposite. They don't want any of those other readers and viewers. They only want the 6% of Americans who are progressives, who are affluent, who are living in these coastal cities. Like it's very targeted. And because digital media allows you to see who everybody is, who's reading you, and your journalists know how to get their emotions going because they know what makes them emotional. Like it was like this sort of marriage between a new profit motive and then a journalistic class that was like uniquely situated to talk to those people.
I want to give the example of the Occupy movement. Now, the Occupy movement was supposed to be against the top 1%. The problem that you found along the way is that a lot of the people who were leading those movements in other cities were kind of pretty well off financially themselves. College kids from elite schools. So now you had that group, that class of people, again, speaking for the working class. Now to add on top of that, you have journalists who are also from that same class reporting on the Occupy movement, and they are also trying to speak for the working class and the middle class people in this country. And then they go back and they write the articles, or they comment on them, or they take video footage or whatever. They report on it on the scene. That is the perspective that is going out, because that's the perspective that the media wants them to have. They want to appeal to that 6% of the population. They don't really care if working class people are not reading these articles. She's saying the quiet part out loud. They don't care if working class and poor people are not watching these stories on CNN or MSNBC or Fox News. That's not who they're trying to reach. They're trying to make an emotional connection with the upper middle class and people who are wealthy, because those are the people that have money and those are the people that can keep them in business. Money drives all of it. Money drives all of it. Why do you guys hear me tell you multiple times, people have offered me sponsorships for this show and I won't take them? There's a reason. Your message is going to change. May not change in the beginning, but at some point later on, I mean, look what happened to TYT, right? So I think what we have to understand, they really don't care what we want. They really don't care what the working class, the poor, and the middle class people want in this country and want to hear, want to read, want to see. They really don't. This is one of the reasons why mainstream media is so dangerous. Saying the quiet part out loud.
Well, that's fascinating. Thank you. Also, though, that I can, as you described that, Batya, it became clear that that when you get to the data capture part of that, that is again how the economic imperatives bias the reporting of the news. That, and also though how it's led to an inaccurate understanding of American, let's say, cultural life, because if you read these newspapers, if you watch these TV shows, you might feel that this is the cultural temperature, but actually it's a very small subset. So I suppose that,
and I want to use the example of politics for example, and I'm glad Russell Brand said that it's actually just a small sample, the view of the 6%, not so much the majority. And I'll use the example with the 2020 presidential campaign. If you go back and you watch the news stories in reference to Bernie Sanders and Joe Biden, notice how mainstream media had pretty much convinced people that the majority wanted someone like Joe Biden, wanted someone like an Elizabeth Warren, wanted someone who was more moderate. They even tried to do it with Kamala Harris, and she couldn't even get a single delegate. That was not the majority. They tried to do that, even though multiple times throughout the race, Bernie Sanders was number one in the polls. They were speaking for what that 6% of people wanted. They were speaking, they were telling you, this is what upper middle class and wealthy elite people want. Even though the working class people, poor people, wanted someone like Bernie Sanders. They did the same thing with Trump and Hillary. They tried to convince you that the majority of people wanted Hillary Clinton. They were talking about the people of a certain class, the people of a certain education, the elite. Why do you think they put on the polls, how many of you went to college? They didn't really want to report on what working class people wanted with Trump and Hillary either. A lot of working class and poor people during the 2016 election, some of them wanted Bernie Sanders. When Bernie Sanders, suspended his race, they moved over to Donald Trump. Well, why would they do that? Because they were talking about some of the same things. They were calling out corruption. So the media that you see on those channels, they are not speaking to the lower class. They are not representing the local class for that very same reason. And that was one of the questions I used to have for the longest time. Why don't they bring on working class people and ask them these questions? Why are they asking Al Sharpton instead? That's why. They don't want you to hear it. They want you to believe something else. So when you watch it, what they say is the majority. Keep that in mind and take it with a grain of salt that it actually could be the opposite. Just something to consider.
what that suggests to me is that there is when you talk about latent power, that this latent power ultimately is a psychic and spiritual phenomena that you're dealing with. The energy of individuals, the attention of individuals, the potential ability of individuals galvanized and motivated by a relevant ideology to transition out of one set of social ideals and into a new set of social ideals. It seems that there's been a sort of in a sense, referring to the earlier part of our conversation, a sort of a cultural coup in terms of the kind of a linguistic alteration and cultural paraphernalia that phatically represents a set of ideals within this sort of like, you know, movement of progressivism. Again, to reiterate, when it comes to actual racial, gender, equality, these are ideas that I'm of course supportive of, but I've always been cynical about the deployment of these ideas in corporate and media spaces, in the same way that I don't think that Unilever particularly care about green issues and climate change, but that they will utilize these ideas where convenient. When it comes to rebooting, awakening a dormant class that previously had, as you say, 5 communist newspapers to choose from, and a sort of a somewhat robust social democratic political movement. And
by the way, very difficult to find that now. If you were looking for some type of communist like newspapers, whatever, not as easy to find it now. There's a reason for that.
You know, even media class to now a situation where they're unrepresented, ignored, or demonized at best. What kind of political movement do you think is required to reawaken them, given that the most recent examples appear to be sort of ethno-nationalist movements, or at least they've been rendered as such as you know, Trump, for an obvious example, Brexit in our country, and even in countries like India with Modi or whatever that dude's called, you know, like sort of where sort of like these retroactive kind of nationalist ideas are reawakened precisely because they probably have a sort of a nostalgic tug that the progressivism by its nature cannot incorporate. What do you think will be
This is a long question, but yeah, I saw that in the chat. She is nodding a lot.
a more legitimate a legitimate manifesto, or what would be pieces of a legitimate manifesto that might reawaken this dormant class?
Well, so we're very lucky in America because this country was founded on an idea rather than an ethnicity.
Well, what do you think? Does that make sense to you?
So that's the end of that there. I don't think he showed the part where she answered that. No, he didn't show that part. But again, like this journalist, just be wary of the fact that I think she may be more of like a Barry Weiss kind of journalist, but she's right when it comes to the class issue and what they tend to focus on. And again, I don't think that's by mistake. That's on purpose. They really don't want to represent the voice for the working class and poor and middle class people. They really don't want someone that's going to do that. I want to get to some of the comments here. Salty Digital Dive said, so 6% have the ability to affect power. Isn't it frustrating and maybe somewhat sad that a small percentage of people actually are the ones that affect power? Just like when we talk about the top 1%, it's a small percentage that really control it. Max Fiend said, my unpaid internship ended with my boss asking me to spot her $250. What? I don't know what that's about. Yikes. JB said, unpaid internships are made for rich kids to network so they get hired through connections. Exactly. Zeneb says, that's also how everyone who gets into politics does it too. They are wealthy and can afford internships on Capitol Hill. Yeah. And a lot of them are lawyers. You ever notice that? JB says, corporate commentator, I talked to a few people and they think means I spoke to people in my elite class who share the same elitist opinion. Boom. It kind of reminds me too of the friends, and you guys let me know if you have this friend. I think a lot of us had this friend at some point in our life. Have you ever had a friend and they're having a conversation with you and they tell you what other people are saying, and they'll use this phrase? Well, you know, some people feel that they don't really want to go to the event on Friday. And you'll come back and say, who are the people? Oh, no, just some. A lot of people? No, just some people. And then you come to find out that they're really speaking for themselves. Anyone have a friend like that? They just don't want to admit that they're the ones that feel that way. So they'll use the term some people. Yeah. Zeneb says, yep, we couldn't get coverage for Paula Jean, even though she was taking on Manchin and polling well. You see? That's another one.